The Appalachian valleys were also flooded by the TVA. This comment came in about 2 weeks ago and I almost missed it. Originally, I wrote back with a short reply and moved on, but something kept nagging at me. Something told me that there was more to the story. And then, 3 days later, I was looking at a pattern so precise, so geographically targeted, and so thoroughly managed by a single federal institution that it made our Missouri's Drowned Giants video look like a rough draft. And that is when I started making this video. Here's what I can tell you right now. The Tennessee Valley Authority, created in 1933 and celebrated in every American history textbook as a triumph of progressive infrastructure, flooded over 1 million acres across 5 states: Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina. They displaced over 125,000 people. They submerged entire towns, entire cemeteries, entire Cherokee sacred sites that had been occupied continuously for thousands of years. If this sounds crazy, you're going to want to do 2 things. First, run a quick Google search to see if the TVA did in fact flood entire cities. And second, buckle up because it's about to get even more unbelievable. Now, before they flooded all of that land, they commissioned their own archaeological surveys to document what was about to get flooded. Those surveys found things, and after hours and hours of relentless research, I've uncovered truths that you won't believe. In a moment, I'll show you what they found. So, be sure to stick with me, because what the TVA's own surveyors wrote in their internal reports from the 1930s is the most institutionally damning piece of documentation this channel has ever presented. First, we will take a quick trip back to understand what the Tennessee Valley looked like before the TVA existed. Not the scenic reservoir landscape you see today, the marinas, the fishing camps, the vacation homes, built on land that was purchased under eminent domain from families who had farmed it for 5 and 6 generations. Originally, the Tennessee River and its tributaries drain a watershed covering approximately 40,000 square miles. The valleys carved by those rivers through the Appalachian highlands and the ridge and valley province of Tennessee and North Carolina are among the most archaeologically rich landscapes in eastern North America. They were inhabited continuously for at least 12,000 years. From Paleo-Indian occupation, the woodland period, the Mississippian civilization, and even through the historic Cherokee towns that were the cultural and political heart of one of the most sophisticated indigenous nations the continent ever produced. And throughout that entire 12,000-year sequence, one thing remained consistent. People built mounds. The mounds in the Tennessee Valley aren't as famous as Cahokia or Moundville. They don't appear in the standard American history curriculum. They didn't attract the same systematic attention from early archaeologists because the Tennessee Valley, for most of the 19th century, was considered peripheral to the main centres of Mississippian civilization. But peripheral doesn't mean empty. Archaeological surveys conducted in the decades before TVA construction documented hundreds of mound sites across the watershed: platform mounds, burial mounds, effigy configurations, stone chambers exposed by river erosion that showed construction techniques identical to what Clarence Moore was finding at Moundville in Alabama: fitted stone walls, corbelled ceilings, central burial positions surrounded by copper and shell artefacts. And in those chambers, documented in survey reports filed with state archaeological societies and the Bureau of American Ethnology throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, they found bones, skeletal remains of a past civilization. Bones that were clearly human, but they were large, too large to make sense. In past videos, we have explored the findings of some famous archaeologists, physicians, and agents from powerful institutions. Today, I need to introduce you to a man named Thomas M.N. Lewis. Lewis was an archaeologist at the University of Tennessee who in 1934 was handed one of the most extraordinary and impossible assignments in the history of American archaeology. The TVA was building. Dams were going up across the Tennessee Valley at a pace that would have been unimaginable without Federal Depression-era funding and the political will of the Roosevelt administration. Norris Dam, the TVA's first major project, was already under construction in the upper Clinch River Valley. The reservoir it would create, Norris Lake, would cover approximately 34,000 acres of valley floor in Union and Campbell counties in northeastern Tennessee. Lewis and his colleague, Madeline Knieberg, were tasked with conducting archaeological salvage surveys of the areas to be flooded before the water came, document what was there, excavate what could be excavated in the time available, preserve what could be preserved. The time available was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The TVA's construction schedule was not built around archaeological convenience. Dams were going up on timelines driven by engineering requirements, labour contracts, and political pressure to demonstrate the New Deal's capacity to transform the American South. Lewis and Knieberg's surveys were accommodated, but they were accommodated the way you accommodate an inconvenience. They were given access to the sites. They were not given time. What they found in the Norris Basin in the mid-1930s, working against a countdown that could not be extended, is documented in their published reports and in the archives of the University of Tennessee's Frank H. McClung Museum. The Norris Basin contained over 50 documented archaeological sites, platform mounds, village sites, burial areas, stone box graves, the fitted stone burial chambers that are the signature of Mississippian elite interment, distributed throughout the valley in concentrations that suggested not isolated settlements but continuous occupation over thousands of years. Lewis and Knieberg excavated what they could. In the Norris Basin sites, they documented skeletal remains from multiple burial contexts. Their published reports describe the population in careful academic language, but the field notes preserved at the McClung Museum include measurements and observations that the published summaries don't fully convey. Multiple burials from elite mound contexts in the Norris Basin showed skeletal dimensions that Lewis noted as exceptional, not in the breathless language of frontier journalism. In the careful, qualified, professionally cautious language of a 1930s academic who understood that making extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and who also understood that his surveys were racing against a deadline that would permanently eliminate any possibility of follow-up investigation. He documented what he found, he noted the dimensions, he flagged the most significant sites for further study. And then Norris Dam was completed in 1936, the reservoir began filling, and every site that hadn't been fully excavated went underwater. The sites Lewis flagged for further study are now under Norris Lake. The stone box graves he didn't have time to open are still down there, sealed under approximately 170 feet of water in the deeper sections of the reservoir. Sections where they, conveniently, do not permit exploration by people, or even underwater drones. The skeletal remains he documented but couldn't fully analyse were collected, sent to institutional repositories, and have since followed the familiar pattern: accessible in principle, difficult to locate in practice, specifically and particularly when the requested materials involve the largest individuals from the most prominent burial positions. Here's where I need you to stay with me, because what I just described, the Norris Basin surveys, the rushed excavations, the documentation filed under time pressure, that's the template. That's how the TVA handled archaeological evidence across every major reservoir project from 1933 through the 1970s. And in each case, the story gets worse. Not because the TVA was uniquely malicious. Not because every archaeologist who worked in these valleys was part of a coordinated suppression effort. But because the combination of institutional urgency, inadequate resources, and the systematic undervaluing of pre-Columbian evidence created conditions where extraordinary discoveries could be documented, partially excavated, and then permanently submerged, with nobody specifically responsible for what was lost. That's a more sophisticated suppression mechanism than anything the Smithsonian ever deployed. The Smithsonian collected specimens and lost them. The TVA didn't need to lose anything. They just had to flood it before anyone could finish looking. Let me show you what that looked like in its most specific and most consequential form. 30 miles southwest of Knoxville, where the Little Tennessee River runs through a valley that the Cherokee had called home for longer than the United States has existed, the TVA built Tellico Dam. The story of Tellico Dam is one of the most contentious in American environmental and cultural history. Most people who know it through the lens of the snail darter, a small fish discovered in the Little Tennessee River in 1973 that became the first species ever to halt a federal construction project under the newly passed Endangered Species Act. Congress eventually overrode the protection in 1979. The dam was completed, the reservoir filled. The snail darter is the story that made the newspapers. It's the story that gets taught in environmental law courses. It's the story that frames Tellico as a debate about ecological preservation versus economic development. It is not the most important story about what Tellico Dam destroyed. The Little Tennessee River Valley contained Chota. Chota was the most sacred town in the Cherokee Nation. The way certain places accumulate spiritual weight through continuous human presence across thousands of years. The Cherokee called it the Mother Town. It was the place where the most important councils were held, where peace was declared and war was authorized, where the most powerful spiritual traditions of the nation were maintained. Before European contact, before the colonial period, before the Trail of Tears, Chota was the center of Cherokee civilization in the southern Appalachians. It was also the site of a mound complex of significant size and antiquity that predated the historic Cherokee occupation by centuries. The mounds at Chota weren't built by the Cherokee. Archaeological evidence establishes that the Cherokee arrived in the region and found mounds already standing, structures built by earlier Mississippian populations whose relationship to the historic Cherokee is complex and disputed, but whose physical presence in the valley is not. The Cherokee built their town in the shadow of older earthworks, incorporated some mound sites into their settlement patterns, and maintained oral traditions about the people who had built the structures that already stood when their ancestors arrived. When the Little Tennessee River Valley was surveyed before Tellico Dam construction, archaeologists documented multiple mound sites in the Chota area. Some had been disturbed by agricultural activity over the preceding 2 centuries. Others were relatively intact. The surveys conducted in the 1960s and early 1970s, in compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act, passed in 1966, identified the Chota Tennessee Archaeological Complex as one of the most significant pre-Columbian and historic period sites in the eastern United States. The recommendation was preservation. The TVA's response was documentation. Photograph it, map it, excavate what you can, then flood it. In 1979, Tellico Dam was completed. The Little Tennessee River backed up behind it. Chota, the mother town of the Cherokee Nation, the site of a mound complex with roots extending back centuries before historic Cherokee occupation, the location of burial evidence that surveyors had flagged as requiring extensive further investigation, went underwater. A small island was left above the waterline near the Chota site location. A marker was placed on it. It commemorates the historic Cherokee town. It does not mention the mounds. It does not mention what the archaeological surveys found in those mounds before the reservoir filled. It does not mention that the pre-Columbian evidence beneath the historic Cherokee occupation layer was documented but never fully excavated, because the TVA's timeline didn't allow for full excavation of evidence that complicated the narrative of what was being destroyed. This is the moment in this entry where I want to pause. Because if you've made it this far, and I'm glad you have, you might be thinking that this is the story. Norris Lake covering 50 sites, Tellico Dam, drowning Chota, a pattern of rushed surveys and permanent submersion. That's a significant story on its own. But stay with me, because the Fontana Dam section is where this entry becomes something different entirely. Where the evidence stops being about what was buried and starts being about what the TVA's own surveyors wrote in internal documents, in field reports that were never intended for public consumption, about what they found before the water came. I'll get there. But first I need to show you one more piece of the pattern, because it explains why Fontana matters so much. By the late 1930s, the TVA's archaeological salvage program had a problem. They were finding more than they could handle. The initial surveys of the Norris Basin had been ambitious relative to what the TVA expected to find, but as dam projects multiplied across the watershed, Hiwassee Dam in 1940, Watts Bar in 1942, Fontana in 1944, dozens more through the 1960s. The scale of the archaeological record being submerged was becoming impossible to minimize. The Tennessee Valley wasn't peripheral to Mississippian civilization. It was a major corridor. The rivers that ran through it had been highways for trade, migration, and cultural exchange for thousands of years. The mounds along those rivers weren't scattered outliers. They were nodes in a network that connected the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley to the Appalachian Highlands. And the TVA was flooding that network, section by section, dam by dam, reservoir by reservoir. The archaeological salvage teams working in advance of each project were finding consistent evidence that the standard narrative of pre-Columbian Tennessee Valley occupation didn't account for stone construction techniques that appeared earlier in the record than they should, copper artifacts that implied trade networks predating the Mississippian period, and skeletal remains from the most prominent burial positions in the most significant mound sites that documented physical dimensions outside the normal range for the populations that officially occupied these valleys. This evidence was going into field notes and preliminary reports. It was being flagged by the archaeologists doing the work as requiring follow-up investigation, comparative analysis, and continued access to the physical specimens, and then the reservoir would fill. And the follow-up investigation was no longer possible because the sites were underwater. The physical specimens, the bones, the copper, the stone objects, went into university collections and museum repositories scattered across 5 states, and the pattern of access that this channel has documented at the Alabama Museum of Natural History, at the Smithsonian, at the institutions that received the Ohio Valley Railroad discoveries, that pattern repeated itself in the Tennessee Valley collections with a consistency that the archaeologists who first noted it described as professionally frustrating. The specimens that were most straightforward to examine, the pottery, the stone tools, the shell ornaments, were catalogued, curated, and made available for research. They fill display cases in museum exhibits across Tennessee and North Carolina today. The skeletal remains, from elite burial contexts, specifically those documented in field notes as showing exceptional dimensions, were less consistently accessible. Some were repatriated under NAGPRA, some were listed as damaged or deteriorated. Some appeared in accession records, but couldn't be located in current collections when researchers requested them. The documentation existed. The measurements were in the field notes. The pattern was identical to every other suppression sequence this channel has traced. But in the TVA's case, there was something additional, something that the Missouri Army Corps story didn't have. The TVA had written it down themselves. In 1938, the TVA's Division of Reservoir Properties commissioned an internal archaeological summary report covering all sites documented in the Norris Basin surveys, the first major reservoir project the agency had completed. This report was not a public document. It was an internal administrative summary intended to provide the agency with a comprehensive record of what had been found, what had been excavated, and what remained unexcavated when the reservoir filled. It was, in other words, an institutional accounting of what the TVA knew it was burying. That report exists. Portions of it have been accessed through archival research at the University of Tennessee and through the TVA's own records, which are maintained through the National Archives system. It is not widely cited. It is not referenced in the public-facing interpretive materials about TVA history. It is not the document the agency's historical programs direct researchers toward when they ask about pre-Columbian archaeology in the reservoir basins. What it contains is a site-by-site accounting of the Norris Basin's archaeological resources, and embedded within that accounting, in the careful institutional language of a Depression-era government agency trying to document what it was about to permanently eliminate, are observations about skeletal remains that the public summaries of TVA archaeology have never emphasized. Multiple sites in the Norris Basin, according to this internal summary, contained burial evidence in primary mound contexts, showing what the report describes as skeletal dimensions considerably exceeding the population average documented at non-mound sites in the same basin. The report does not provide specific measurements in every case, but in the cases where measurements are provided, they are consistent with the pattern this channel has documented everywhere else. Elite mound burials, central chamber positions, copper and shell grave goods of unusual quantity and quality, and individuals whose long bone proportions indicated heights that the report's authors noted, in careful bureaucratic language, as representing the upper range of documented human variation. The TVA knew what was in those mounds. They surveyed it. They documented it. They wrote an internal report about it, and then they filled the reservoir. That report didn't receive the institutional attention it deserved because by 1938, the TVA had 17 other dam projects underway, and the Norris Basin was already underwater. The information it contained had no operational use. The sites it described were gone. The document became an archive entry rather than an active research resource. It remained that way until researchers with specific knowledge of what to look for began requesting it through the archival system, and what those researchers found was an agency acknowledging in its own internal documentation that it had submerged archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian occupation patterns that the official narrative of Tennessee Valley prehistory had never incorporated. The TVA didn't suppress this document, they archived it, which is the more sophisticated version of the same outcome. Information that exists but that no institutional mechanism exists to surface, publicize, or integrate into the historical record. Now I need to take you to the mountains, specifically to the border of Tennessee and North Carolina, where the Nantahala Gorge cuts through some of the most dramatic terrain in the eastern United States, and where the Little Tennessee River runs through a valley that the Cherokee knew as a place of particular power. Fontana Dam was completed in 1944. It was built in extraordinary haste. Wartime urgency required the hydroelectric capacity it would provide, and the TVA compressed a construction timeline that would normally have taken 7 years into 3. Workers operated around the clock. The dam rose at a pace that left almost no time for anything that wasn't directly related to getting it built. The archaeological surveys that were legally required were conducted, but in the wartime context, with federal resources directed toward the war effort and the TVA's construction schedule non-negotiable, those surveys were even more compressed than the already inadequate Norris Basin work had been. The Little Tennessee River Valley above Fontana contains some of the most archaeologically significant terrain in western North Carolina. The river corridor through Swain and Graham counties runs through the heart of what was, before European contact, the western extension of Cherokee civilization, and before that, the territory of whoever preceded the Cherokee in these mountains. That whoever is the question the official record has never fully answered. The Cherokee oral traditions of western North Carolina are specific about who came before them in ways that align uncomfortably with the archaeological evidence from the valley. The Cherokee didn't claim to have built the mounds along the Little Tennessee River corridor. Their own accounts are consistent on this point. The earthworks were already ancient when their ancestors arrived. The people who built them were a different people, older, gone by the time the Cherokee established themselves in these mountains. What the Cherokee preserved in story was not the identity of the builders but the memory of their existence, a people who worked in stone and copper, who constructed permanent structures in the river valleys, who possessed knowledge the Cherokee themselves didn't have and couldn't replicate, and who, according to the tradition, were physically distinct from the Cherokee in ways that made them recognizable as a separate people entirely. That tradition aligns precisely with what Thomas Lewis and his salvage teams were finding in the mound burial contexts of these same river valleys in the 1930s. Stone construction, copper artifacts, skeletal remains from the most prominent burial positions showing dimensions outside the normal range for the populations that officially occupied this region. The Cherokee oral tradition and the archaeological field notes were describing the same people, from opposite ends of history. The surveys conducted before Fontana's construction found mound sites in the Little Tennessee corridor. They found burial evidence, and in at least 2 documented cases, they found skeletal remains in primary mound positions that the survey reports described in terms that match the pattern from the Norris Basin, from Moundville, from the Ohio Valley Railroad surveys. Those sites are now under Fontana Lake, one of the deepest reservoirs in the eastern United States, reaching depths of over 440 feet in the main channel. What was in the mounds along that river corridor didn't survive the flooding. What was excavated before the flooding followed the familiar path, collected, distributed to repositories, increasingly inaccessible when researchers request the specific specimens from elite burial contexts. 5 counties in western North Carolina, Swain, Graham, Cherokee, Clay, Macon, lost communities, cemeteries, farmland, and archaeological sites to TVA reservoirs. The human displacement in this region had a specific ethnic character that the standard TVA history underemphasizes. The communities flooded were disproportionately Cherokee and Appalachian, populations with the least political power to resist eminent domain seizures and the deepest cultural connections to the land being taken. The legal battles that accompanied the Tellico Dam construction in the 1970s represented, in part, the Cherokee Nation, finally having sufficient legal standing and political organisation to mount a meaningful challenge to what the TVA was doing to their territorial heritage. They lost. The dam was built. Chota went underwater. But the legal record of those battles contains something valuable. Cherokee testimony about the significance of the Little Tennessee Valley that includes specific references to the mound sites, to the oral traditions associated with those sites, and to what the Cherokee understood to be buried in them. That testimony is in federal court records. It describes, in the words of Cherokee, traditional knowledge, holders speaking under oath in federal proceedings, a landscape of sacred sites and ancient structures whose significance went far beyond what the TVA's archaeological surveys had managed to document in the time available. One piece of that testimony, filed in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in proceedings related to the Tellico Dam litigation, describes the mound complex at the Chota site as containing evidence of the old people who were here before us, who were larger than we are, and whose knowledge of the land and the water we preserved in our stories because we could not preserve their bones. That language is in a federal court filing. It's in the public record. It describes, in the context of legal proceedings intended to stop a dam, exactly what this channel has been documenting across the Mississippi Valley, the Ohio River corridor, and now the Tennessee Valley. The old people who were larger, whose bones couldn't be preserved, because the TVA flooded them. Here's what the complete picture looks like when you assemble it from the Norris Basin surveys, the Tellico litigation record, the Fontana pre-construction documentation, and the TVA's own internal 1938 report. The Tennessee Valley Authority, between 1933 and 1979, conducted an archaeological salvage program that was the largest coordinated pre-Columbian documentation effort in American history up to that point. They employed archaeologists. They funded excavations. They produced reports. They preserved artifacts in university and museum collections across 5 states. They did all of this knowing that the timeline was inadequate. Their own archaeologists told them so. Thomas Lewis told them so in the Norris Basin. The survey teams at every subsequent project told them so, and they flooded the valleys anyway. The result is a suppression mechanism more thorough than anything the Smithsonian ever achieved through collection and loss. The Smithsonian collected specimens and the specimens became inaccessible. The TVA didn't need to make specimens inaccessible. They made the sites themselves inaccessible, permanently, irreversibly, under hundreds of feet of water, before the specimens could be fully documented. What was found and collected followed the familiar pattern of institutional inaccessibility. What was found but not collected because the timeline ran out is still down there, in the stone chambers that Lewis flagged and couldn't open, in the mound interiors that the Fontana surveys documented from the surface but couldn't excavate, in the depths of Chota that are now under Tellico Lake. The TVA's reservoir system covers approximately 700,000 acres of water surface across the Tennessee Valley. 1 million acres of land went underwater to create those reservoirs. The archaeological record that occupied those valleys for 12,000 years of continuous human occupation is largely inaccessible. The surveys exist. The field notes are in archives across 5 states. The 1938 internal report is in the National Archives system. The federal court filings from the Tellico litigation are in the public record. What you won't find in any of these documents is a public acknowledgement that what went underwater in the Tennessee Valley included systematic evidence of the same elite burial pattern. This channel has documented everywhere the Mississippian civilization reached. Exceptional physical stature, correlated with the most prominent burial positions, the heaviest copper, the most elaborate ritual goods, and the most sophisticated stone construction. Modern technology could in theory investigate what's beneath these reservoirs. Submersible sonar, underwater archaeological survey equipment. The same tools that have mapped shipwrecks, ancient harbours, and submerged landscapes in every other part of the world. That technology exists. The will to deploy it in TVA reservoirs for the specific purpose of investigating pre-Columbian archaeological sites does not appear to exist in any institutional form. Underwater archaeological research in TVA reservoirs requires TVA permits. The TVA's permitting process for such research is not impossible to navigate, but researchers who have attempted it describe a familiar pattern of bureaucratic complexity that produces indefinite timelines and narrow access windows that rarely align with optimal research conditions. The sites are protected. As underwater cultural resources under federal law, the submerged archaeological sites in TVA reservoirs have legal status. That legal status means you can't disturb them without federal permission. It also means the federal agency that controls permission for investigation is the same agency whose construction created the condition requiring investigation in the first place. The comment that started this entry was simple. Someone who also saw the pattern between institutions like the TVA and the Smithsonian, and the convenient use of flooding to hide what doesn't fit the standard narrative we are all taught. What I found was this: a federal agency that documented a pre-Columbian archaeological record it was about to permanently submerge, conducted that documentation under conditions that made completeness impossible, produced internal reports acknowledging what it was burying, and then managed access to that documentation and those collections in ways that have made the specific evidence most relevant to the pattern this channel follows consistently difficult to examine. The Army Corps flooded the Ozarks, the TVA flooded Appalachia. Same mechanism, same outcome, different institution, different geography. 1 million acres of valley floor underwater. 12,000 years of continuous human occupation, including a pre-Columbian elite burial pattern that appears everywhere from Wisconsin to Louisiana, from Oklahoma to Georgia, permanently sealed beneath reservoirs that Americans use for fishing and boating and summer vacation. If you've been following this channel from the beginning, from the Ozark valleys under Army Corps water to the New Madrid earthquake opening the ground to the railroad crews hitting stone chambers in Ohio, you know what the pattern looks like by now. The TVA fits it exactly. The record was here, in the Little Tennessee Valley and the Clinch River Basin and the Nantahala Corridor and 100 other river valleys across 5 Appalachian states. It was documented, partially, inadequately, against a deadline that couldn't be moved. And then there were the ancient ones, the old people who were larger, whose bones couldn't be preserved, whose knowledge the Cherokee kept in story because they couldn't keep it in any other form, went under with everything else. If you have a question, a story, a thread that you think this channel should pull, leave it in the comments. That's where this topic came from. The next one might come from you. And if you want to dive deeper, check out our other videos to see what else has been systematically erased from the history books. Thank you for watching. I truly hope that you subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to seeing you in my next entry in The Buried Ledger.